This will be our final Reading Africa Week / Reading Africa Month panel. And we're really excited to have a really great slate of writers, translators, an agent, publishers. It's a really exciting group. Isaac de Vries from LitNet, and LitNet is our partner with this one, was supposed to be here, but he was called away. So I'm just going to read a brief introduction to tell you all a little bit about LitNet and Pan-Africans. So LitNet is an online website that's been around, an online website, obviously, is a website that's been around for nearly 25 years, and it publishes a number of African languages, with Afrikaans as the lead, and English and Dutch are also published. And Isaac is also on the board of Pan-Afrikaans, and it's a chapter of Pan International. And Pan-Afrikaans has a fund that sponsors the translation of Afrikaans fiction into languages beyond South Africa's borders. The fund has sponsored translations into English, French, Arabic, Dutch, Albanian. You can search Pan-Afrikaans Translation Fund via Google, and afterwards we could drop in an email for being able to contact them if you have a project that you'd like to discuss with them. So to begin, I'm going to hand it off to Raphael Thierry, who will be leading this discussion. And then I'm going to shut my camera off. So really looking forward to this.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ashanta. So happy to be back here with you guys. But first thing I want to say is really thank you to all the team which is supporting the Read Africa Week, Sarabel, Jessica, Ashanta, and Isaac, and all the lovely people that are here today. It's great to be together and to have this discussion on such a rich topic, addressing this question of African languages with a global audience is on the first place, I would say, a challenge of publishers' visions, of writers' engagements, but also this central art, indeed, of translation to transition one language to the other. Translators, such as writers, such as publishers, always have this central role of transmission that is essential for any leading or minority indigenous language across the world. But this being said, African languages are always a central challenge in the global publishing industry that is more and more, I would say, polarized within a certain limited number of languages and marketplaces. So here, from that maybe first statement, I'm expecting that we will have a lively and lovely conversation. What I also hope is that if someone is saying something which sparkles the interest of one of the participants, please do not hesitate to come back and to, let's have this discussion in the most lively and pleasant way. And we have about 1 hour. We'll need to be a little bit concise, I guess, but we will have also a bit of time at the end to welcome some questions of the people that are following the conversation here. So yes, that's it. Maybe I could start by introducing our dear participants and panelists. So maybe first with Hannes Barnard. You're a South African author, writing both in English and in Afrikaans. You're a novelist. You've debuted with a young adult genre in 2019, if I'm correct. And you translated your first novel, Hale Ze Commit, from Afrikaans towards English. Very sorry for my accent, by the way. My accent in English and in Afrikaans. Then you have followed up with 2 other works, a crime novel, and an apocalyptic young adult's adventure. I'm very much interested to discover that one as well. You're also a traveler. You have been based in the Seychelles, in England, and you're currently in South Africa. We will come back to your rich experience later on, I guess. Then
Thank you very much.
I would like to introduce Tina Kover. Tina, you're a translator of about a dozen works of fiction and non-fiction that are including many, many world-renowned classics and recent major writers. By the way, I was so happy to see that you have translated Benoit Peters. I'm so fond of his work, so that's amazing. But many, many others, your work is fantastic. Your translation have been nominated twice, if I'm correct, to the Impact Dublin International Literary Award, and you've been the recipient of the 2009 Literary Translation Fellowship from the US National Endowment for the Arts, and you're based in the northern of England.
Right.
I would add something important. You've started recently, and we will talk about that too, I guess, this project, Translators Aloud, gathering many translators, maybe into some sort of worldwide discussion. We will talk about it, hopefully. Then Bhakti Shringarpure, you're a writer, an editor, an academic. You're currently running the Radical Books Collective. You will certainly talk about it. You're also the founding editor of Warscapes online magazine that you have run for about 10 years or so.
Yep.
You have edited and published many works on post-colonial literature, literature from the Horn of Africa, including Sudan and South Sudan, Kenya as well, if I'm correct. And you will complete, of course, later on in the discussion, but you're also a translator from French to English. So you have many hats. That's amazing. And that's always fascinating to discuss with colleagues that are so much into different aspects of the industry, so to say. Maybe introducing me very, very briefly. I'm Raphael Thierry. I'm a literary agent based in France. I've started my literary agency about 1 year ago. I'm focusing on let's say, world literature, not only from French to other languages, which means that I'm very much interested in working towards African languages, translation towards African languages, or translation from African languages towards any possible language in the world. So on this some small words and introduction, I think I would like to maybe start asking you some question, and then we could have this in the flow. My very first question was to Hannes, the writer, maybe, but also a little bit of a translator. I would like to know more about you, positioning between Afrikaans and English in your writings, and also about your translating your work and how you're handling this juggling exercise between two languages. For me, it's very interesting and fascinating.
Thank you very much. First of all, it's great to be here. So it's great to be part of this panel. I really appreciate it. And yeah, the question is interesting because I think we in South Africa are very fortunate, and I think a lot of people who come from countries where there are multiple languages spoken are fortunate in the way that you grow up with access without you even having to learn a language. You have access to languages. So in South Africa, we have 11, soon to be 12 official languages, and when I grew up, obviously I grew up in a very different time in South Africa, which was part of the reason why I wrote my first book. But we'll get to that later, maybe. But in terms of language acquisition, my home language, my mother tongue, if you like, is Afrikaans. So that is the language of my parents, etc. But I grew up in a society and in a region of South Africa, in KwaZulu-Natal, which is very English. And so without doing anything, I had the privilege of acquiring English from a very young age. And similarly, I went to a school that was a dual medium school, so it was Afrikaans English. I grew up in a rural area, so we had small classes where you'll have Afrikaans and English kids in the same class, and the teacher would switch between the two languages halfway through. And even at university, it was very similar. When I was doing my honors degree, it was kind of the same scenario. You'd have Afrikaans, and then it'll switch in halfway through the sentence, and it'll be English. So I'm very fortunate that I had this opportunity. So long story short, Afrikaans and English are both, I consider myself to be fairly bilingual. I understand a little bit of other languages, but in terms of fluency, I consider myself bilingual. And when it comes to writing, I don't always write or think about the story in a certain language. So certain books come to me, and it sounds strange, but they come to me in a language. So for instance, the book that I translated, Halley's Comet, came to me in English, first of all. So I wrote the original text in English. Later on, I translated it into Afrikaans, and then the reworked story I translated back into English. So it was the Afrikaans version that was first published, and then the translated version of the Afrikaans version, the English one, I then published with Catalyst Press. So that's how it comes to me. The very first novel I attempted, which is unpublished and is in the top of my closet, it was an English novel. Luckily, nobody published it because it was terrible, but it was a great learning curve. And then later on, so that's my novel, Halley's Comet. That's with Catalyst Press. And later on, I worked on a few youth novels. So this is my apocalyptic Afrikaans story. It's called Volk, which is cloud in English, although it doesn't sound as ominous in English as it does in Afrikaans. But they came to me in Afrikaans. So it's a long story short, but I'm in a very fortunate position that I have access to both in my head, and they come to me very naturally because of the culture environment that I grew up in. And there are people in South Africa that have, they grew up in a multilingual environment where they speak 5, 6, 7 languages because they've had access to that from a very young age. So I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you so much. It's very amazing what you say about not thinking a story in a specific language, and then you pictured it out as a choice as well. And this environment of South Africa is so peculiar, and me as a French, it's very amazing because here, let's say minority language, if I have to put this very word, have been crushed a lot across the history, and only French remains, and we always think only into French. We don't have a single choice to make. So for me, it's very amazing and fascinating to hear you, and I think this also could bridge to my maybe second question to Tina, the translator. First, with a very global question about your vision on language diversity within this publishing, this international publishing that you're in contact with, and maybe your own experience as well, especially as a acknowledged translator working across European languages, but even European, what does it mean? And maybe then, for me, this will be very interesting and lovely to hear more about your collaboration with PEN International that is contributing a lot at maintaining a light on translation into and from indigenous or minority languages across the world and into publishing.
I mean, I can start by talking about my own experience, which is that I've been incredibly fortunate to translate several authors that are not French per se, or at least, and not even European French necessarily, but are writing in French, even though they have their roots maybe they grew up speaking a different language. For example, I translated one book by an author called Negar Javadi. The book, the English title is Disoriental, and that she was born in Persia, in Iran, and came to France, emigrated to France at the age of 10, and so now writes in French. So it's an incredibly interesting, kind of chain reaction, because she sort of does her own cultural translation into French, from her Iranian roots, and then I then translate that into English. Also, speaking of sort of I suppose you might call it the African diaspora, I translated a book by a Haitian author last year. Her name is Emily Prophet, and she's Haitian, but obviously Haitian culture has been heavily influenced by people that were brought there as slaves originally. So it's a fascinating, rich culture, a rich sort of type of French, that I was able to work with. But as far as the Translators Aloud project, which is a YouTube channel, and maybe Ashanta will be kind enough to put a link to that in the chat. This was a project that I started in May 2020 with another literary translator, Charlotte Coombe. And what we do is we feature literary translators reading from their own work. So they're short videos. Hannes has very kindly done a reading for us. And, we have well over 500 readings online now, somewhere between 40 and 50 languages, and about 450 translators have submitted videos to us. So it's an incredibly rich repository, and we are, delighted to have several African languages featured on the channel. So in addition to Afrikaans, we have translators, reading from Amharic, and from we have several authors as well that are featured that are they're African, but they're writing in other languages. So we have a Cameroonian author and translator featured, but the book is actually written in French. We have another African author who writes in German, and so the translation is from German, but the book is very much, about the African experience. So I don't know if I've given a very straightforward or clear answer here, but we're basically just trying to capture with the channel just this global richness of languages and translation that we have, and have all of this in one place so people can come and just really get a sense of what an incredible linguistic wealth is out there in the world.
Thank you. No, it does totally answer my question, because this project, Translator Aloud, is so important, because you're putting every language on the same page, and that's what is here essential. Sometimes we're more looking at some languages, and when I say we, I'm not targeting any specific body, just saying that a language will be looked at in maybe just an academic or linguistic perspectives, and you have other languages that are just up to the market. And here you have translators from all over the world discussing their work with writers in every possible language that could be connected to this project. Which reminds me of this Jalada Africa network of translators into African languages, which I think was set up about 10 years ago in Kenya, from Kenya. And such platforms are so essential and vital, if I could say so. So just saying that it's really amazing, and I can't wait to explore this work of yours. So thank you. We'll come back certainly to what you have started presenting here. But I would like here to jump to Bhakti. I could say the editor, but you're also a translator, you're also an academic, but here maybe more as
Editor.
an, yes, choose your own hat. What I want to ask you is about this project of yours that you have been connected towards African literature in the first place, I would say, but what does it mean, African literature? Here it means a lot of writings from the Horn of Africa, and not only literature written into English, but also a lot of literature in different languages. You have focused on many writings from South Sudan and Sudan that are written in Arabic, notably. I think you made a focus in your warscapes perspectives towards many writings from Kenya in Gikuyu, but also Swahili. I think it was a part of your scope. So I would love to hear more about what has maybe carried you toward this notion of this broad notion of languages toward literature, maybe in a certain region of Africa, but maybe in terms of this curiosity of yours in your work and research and editing, etc.
Yeah. Thanks, Raphael. I think, you know, yes, I have many hats, but it's all really just one. It begins with one obsession that leads you to certain literature, certain concepts or understandings of history and translation within it, which is war. You know, I started Warscapes. It came out after I started the online magazine to kind of offer a kind of lens into war, trauma, displacement, and so on. And without it being, there was a sense in Europe and in North America in particular that history sort of stopped with the Second World War, and that, that you will have, to this day, several works of literature, history, nonfiction, what have you, on the First World War and the Second World War, but somehow the over 100 different post-colonial wars, internecine civil wars that were taking place in like the rest of the planet don't get time of day. And this is not just an insular problem that North Americans and Europeans have to deal with. The problem is because of the big C, colonialism. Even the curriculum that we learn, even what, I always knew European history growing up in India better than any of my own. What was happening in my backyard was never really the focus of what I studied, right? So I think I come to it through this. So I don't see myself so much as a specialist of African literature, but I came to it through this, trying to interrogate war and what is produced, what is the culture, literature that is produced out of war. And I think one of the things we get from war is extreme, intense literary production. And within that, also a kind of imperative that one must translate what's happening. There is a sort of a joke that, like, when we get new writers, we either get new writers from war or new cuisines. It's like so it's just how it's a sort of unfortunate way in which it travels, but then it also broadens and enriches our world. But then it also makes translation so extremely urgent. And I think I ended up focusing or becoming more and more interested in the ongoing conflicts at that time, which was the formation of South Sudan and all the things going on in Sudan. And now it's sort of like we're back to that. And a lot of the interest was also coming out of, after 9/11, being very much part of activism for Palestine and so on. And that was another thing, how do you translate this vast continent? Just recently, when you had this incredible Gazan poet and writer killed, Raphael, you saw all his translations now are going up on Twitter. And there was one in Somali, there was, various European languages. It's his poem that says, "If I die." So anyway, to distract from the thing, I think that's how I've ended up in this sort of juncture And I, I think all of us here, we can't talk about languages and translation within the African context without really thinking about the impact of colonialism on publishing, on the infrastructure of publishing, on what gets chosen, what doesn't. And I did translate a work by Boris Diop way back when. And the reason I was drawn to Boris Diop was actually his Rwanda novel, which turns his novel about the genocide in Rwanda. That's the one I wanted to translate. And we ended up meeting in New York. And he said, I would love for you and your co-translator, Sarah, to translate this novel. You all seem to be so wonderful, but actually there is another translator who has the rights and she will be doing it. And we said, does she, actually she didn't have the rights. He said, there's somebody else that's interested. I said, you know what, if we get a publisher, you give it to us. So he said, okay. So it became like, so we went, we drummed up every New York contact we could ever find. And we tried to get this book, Murambi, find a publisher for it. And everyone told us almost the same thing, which is, there's already a book about Rwanda. It's a book by Philip Gorovich, and it's a book of reportage. I said, it's not a novel. What's happening? We can publish 1 million books about the First and Second World War annually, hundreds. But when it comes to Rwanda, the place is immediately finite. So African languages or any African literature, in translation or not in translation, we are dealing with an extremely narrow-minded publishing industry that will not invest in this. And it's not for lack of good intentions. It's almost always this very particular idea of the marketplace, which is actually quite flawed, and it proves again and again that it can be flawed. But I think these are the issues we're working against. And war can't break out every time for something to become urgent. So it's kind of what has to. I think it's changing. I think there are more grants, more money now, but it's still very, very difficult. We're in a difficult place. Sorry, now I've just kind of taken the mood down.
No, not at all. I think you're here bringing so many important aspects of what we are dealing with, which is also somehow maybe this notion of soft powers that are maybe sometimes influencing a lot the industry and language places around the publishing industry and towards worldwide readership. And literature, books are never rid of their very context in terms of structures. So what you're dealing with here is also a strong invitation to open up our minds about what we get into our bookshops and why don't we get more diversity in terms of language, books, and topics as well, especially from certain places of the world. And you were speaking about what you were getting and sometimes being more directly connected towards European literature and so on. And yeah, this is important to be questioned. So Tina and Hannes, if at some point you want to react to something which has just been said, please do so. It's really an open conversation here we need to have.
I would absolutely, I would agree with what Bhakti has just said. So often we translators, who I should mention, maybe for people who aren't familiar with the industry, the vast majority of the time we are also acting as the scouts to find the books, that we think are worthy of translation. Translators themselves will kind of find a book or an author that they're passionate about, and then we do the work of pitching those books to publishing companies. You do sort of run up that against that wall again and again, of will this sell? I mean, that is the bottom line. Obviously, it's to an extent that makes sense. I mean, obviously, a publishing house must make money in order to survive. But it does seem to be, for lack of a better expression, a bit of a lack of imagination in terms of what can really be done in terms of world literature. And I do think it does often happen where you say, well, you know, sort of one successful book has come out, you know, I couldn't possibly give an example, but, you know, one successful book, you know, or two have come out in the last, you know, 5 years that were sort of set in, let's say, Botswana, you know, so maybe that's enough. Maybe the market is satiated, even though it isn't. And so part of what we do at Translators Aloud is we have a dedicated category, a playlist for books that are seeking a publisher. And so in that way, translators who have, you know, done the scouting work, found these incredible works of literature from all over the world, you know, that they're now just desperate to bring to a broader global audience. You know, they're able to kind of put a reading up from these books out there, you know, put the author name, put the translator name, and try to draw more attention. But it is that's just a tiny part of the battle that we're kind of fighting as translators and language industry, you know, people, to kind of broaden the horizons of what publishers will take on.
Yeah, I mean, if I can cut in there, just as a practical example, when I told you my book Halley's Comet, I wrote that in English first off. I sent it to a bunch of literary agents in the UK and the US, and the feedback I got was it was too South African. It's a story about a small town, rural South Africa, and it's set in apartheid South Africa. So it's fairly political, but it's the coming of age story of a 16-year-old white boy, but he's confronted with the realities of the world. So but the feedback I got was it was a bit too South African, and they didn't want to really touch it. So that's why I translated it into Afrikaans. I was very fortunate that it was actually published here, even though it was the wounds are still quite raw in South Africa about apartheid. So it took a brave publisher to take it on. And then it took somebody with the passion for African literature like Jessica to take that English version and say, yes, let's publish this. So there's still a bit of bravery out there that needs to be, you know, for publishers. I think there's no reason why African stories can't sell. I mean, although this is, you know, fantasy fiction, if you look at something like The Gilded Ones, that done so well internationally, it's an African story, it's an African setup, and there's no reason why an African setting, if it's not the rolling hills of Dorset or somewhere in Los Angeles or, you know, Paris, you know, it doesn't have to be those places. It can be Nairobi, it can be Johannesburg, you know, it can be Côte d'Ivoire. It, you know, doesn't matter. There's lots of amazing stories and settings that we're missing out because we are not reading about Africa, and it doesn't always need to be, you know, true, you know, sort of like real hardcore war-torn or emotional fiction. It could be fantasy, it could be, you know, lively graphic novels or whatever. So I think I couldn't agree more with what Bhakti and Tina said. It's opening minds, and that.
And I think, you know, so at Radical Books Collective, you know, I did years of publishing whatever various things, and then I just didn't want to put out content into the world. And then, you know, I wanted to do, it was COVID, and I started Radical Books Collective more to kind of do events and have community and things like that. And we ended up also then, of course, you can never get away from producing things. So we have a podcast called Book Rising, and within that there's a little series called Radical Publishing Futures, and it often features small presses, how they survive, and what are the kind of dynamic strategies presses use. And, I'm always struck by something, Seagull Books, which is based in India. And it's run by a very dynamic man named Naveen Kishore, who publishes stuff from all over the place, and it's all translations. And, and there is always this kind of doomsday scenario about books and nobody reads and And he's like, we just really have to change what the word book is. It's like audiobooks and ebooks and internet books and PDFs. And he's like, it doesn't even matter, what it is. It just has to be, one has to take the leap and just put it out there. And also kind of this fundamental notion that translation or publishing translated works is a type of resistance. It has to be seen as a very political kind of endeavor, right? At the end of the day, you may not get a bestseller out of it ever, and one just has to kind of accept that, but have to have a there is another model that is often the Archipelago Books, which is based in Brooklyn, New York. They have an interesting kind of model where a lot of their bills are paid because they have the rights to Karl Ove Knausgaard's translations, and then they kind of are able to do these, and they have 1-2 authors that gain immense success. For example, Scholastic Mukasonga is extremely successful and has really kind of scaled a certain universe. But then, they piggyback on that. These kind of publishers piggyback on those successes and then keep producing new works into the world. So it's a kind of resistant move, and that's the only way to do it, I think. Anyway.
Personally, I couldn't agree more with what you're saying about the role of independent presses around the globe. You mentioned Archipelago Books and Seagull Books, and about African languages. Some publishers are coming to my mind, like Akko Books in Ghana, and we will maybe talk about it later on, or Cassava Republic, that is based in Abuja and in London, that are having an extremely essential role into putting more languages on the map of publishing and maybe shifting this geography of publishing that is sometimes a bit not extremely representative. I'm sharing a link. Maybe I'm being a bit lazy here. Maybe sometimes a picture worth 1,000 words, and then those are 2 maps that you could access through this link. One is figuring the publishing industry in terms of economical impact. The second one is figuring the language diversity around the world. And it's very interesting because then you have the country in these terms of sort of cartogram that are emphasized because of more language diversity or because of a stronger industry in terms of economy. And those 2 maps are exactly the contrary one to the other. You will check this out. It's very interesting because it represents that when you look at Africa on the economics of publishing, representation in terms of mapping are more or less absent. It seems that there is no Africa on the map in terms of publishing, which is all, of course, false. But we don't get maybe a lot of data from many countries. Then, when it's not represented, many people will think that there is no publishing, no literature there, and then comes all the prejudices and misunderstanding about this diversity of publishing across Africa. On the other way around, when you look at the language diversity, you understand that Africa is the biggest place in the world.
Yeah,
and it's not about only languages, it's about literature, it's about history of literature. This literature into African languages belongs even as writing to at least the 11th century, when I think about the Ajami literature in Mali, as for example. But we'll talk about it later. But this was just to jump to this question of publishing and confronting 2 pictures of the literature and the cultural world. Maybe we could continue with maybe this a little bit, I don't know, maybe this will trigger a little bit of debate, I don't know, but about European languages. I think about 6 or 7 years ago, there was this debate between Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Biodun Jelifo, who was saying that English is an African language. And confronting here, of course, Ngugi wa Thiong'o very strong take on African languages, the place of Gikuyu, and this shifting that African language could represent for writers from Africa. So maybe this is an open question to all of you. What do you think about this, this statement of English is actually an African language?
The person with the Afrikaans needs to weigh in, because that's also been accused of being
Yes.
a
Yes.
yeah.
No, you're 100% correct, because there's been a massive debate, and not just a recent one, for years, whether or not Afrikaans is an indigenous language of South Africa. And the Constitutional Court ruled in favor of Afrikaans being an indigenous language. It's not, but it gets quite technical, because it's not called an African language, it's called an indigenous language. And you know, in my perspective, but obviously I'm completely biased. As a person, you know, my forefathers came to Africa over 300 years ago, and Afrikaans is one of the world's youngest languages. I think officially it's less than 130 years old. No, not even less. It's like 100 years old. So it was spoken for about 130 years. It comes from Dutch, etc. But I mean, that's a long story. It also has a lot of influences in African languages, and then also Malay, etc. So I believe that it is an indigenous language. It is an African language. Now, when it comes to English, in our South African context, it is the language of business in South Africa, as it is in a few of our neighboring countries, you know, the likes of Namibia, to give an example. It is a language that is widely spoken, not necessarily as a first language, but as a second, third, or fourth language. It's the language that's used in courts, that kind of thing. So in that context, is it an African language? That is a very, very loaded question. Is it a language that in South Africa, I can only speak of our context. Has it evolved into a language that has a regional dialect that is unique? Yes. There are a lot of words borrowed, phrases borrowed from indigenous languages, not just Afrikaans, but you know, Zulu, you name it. So it's morphed into something that's not quite the same as, for instance, the British English or the American English, whatever. So I think it is Africanized. It's perhaps not an African language, but it is definitely a language that is empowers a lot of people to be world citizens. So whether that's right or wrong, it's almost a moot point. The reality is a lot of people everywhere in the world speak English, and the access and the level of English that we have access to in a country like South Africa, like Namibia, like Botswana, gives us access to the world, and it opens doors that would otherwise be harder to open. So it's a gateway language, I would say, and a world language rather than just an African language. I don't know if that's an answer, but there we go.
Thank you.
I agree with that very much. Sorry, I just, you know, if such a thing as a lingua franca exists in the world today, English is that lingua franca, and I think you know, it contains it has come to contain words from so many other languages in a way that, let's say, French, for example, hasn't, you know, like it's hard even to say that English now is, I mean, it's not the same language it was 200 or 300 years ago. You know, I think it has become quite a global language in terms of all the borrowings from other languages. Now, you know, if you want to talk about whether or not about the ethics of those borrowings being from, you know, countries that were colonized, that's a whole different conversation. And you know, whether we really have the right to use some of those words, it's maybe debatable. But the fact is that if an African writer, let's say, feels the, you know, the spiritual and creative inspiration to write a book in English, I think, you know, the important thing is that they've written the book and put it out in the world. You know, don't think it should be used as certainly a negative that they've chosen to write in English. I suppose that's not what happens that often, but
yeah. I mean, yeah, I think like the Googie debate, which is always you know, the benchmark to think about it, is that part of that, what he was saying in the 80s was shaped so much by his trip to New Zealand, where they were trying to revive the Maori languages, and you know, meeting Linda Tuhiwai Smith, who was telling him how language education can be integrated, and this is something. And then he kind of like had the flip, and I think so much of what Googie is saying, what came to be called his theory of decolonizing the mind, is less about whether English lives, but more about what dies if English continues its sort of particular supremacy. And for people like me growing up in India, I grew up with 3 Indian languages. It's always a trilingual education. And then on top of it, I lived in another state, so I acquired another language. I think it's about sort of, and then as you progress in your schooling, you know, those kind of languages are taken out because you have to just do well in like the maths and the science and all that. So I think what that does, it does give you this, it cuts you off from your own kin, like my grandmother or whatever, you know, who didn't grow up the same way. And I think that's what moved me so much about Googie's, you know, continues to move me about Googie's work. The truth is, it's incredible because, you know, he writes in Gikuyu, and it's something he's doing, and we're back to that word resistance or decolonizing or whatever. He writes in Gikuyu, it publishes a handful of copies, and then right away there is translation in English, you know. Same with Boris Diop, you know, he had this big switch where he said, okay, I'm going to write in Wolof and I'm going to do all this stuff. And he is also someone who is very political in his thinking and obsessed with sort of this decoloniality at the end of the day, how to kind of decolonize, and language is where it all begins. And then he also right away translates everything back into into French. And then if you say, oh, do you change the book as you go along? He's like, oh yeah, it's totally different by the time. And I was like, okay, so this is just, you're just making so much work for everybody, you know, when you're doing this. But it's not about the supremacy so much as it's the death of the other that is being salvaged, you know. And I think the big issue is the dominance again of the English, French, you know, marketplace, Spanish also, and the lack of a equivalent marketplace where a novel is translated into Somali or Swahili, you know. That's why if you go to Kerala in India, it's really fun. It's the most literate state in India. It's the highest levels of education. And when you go into their bookstores, you see that like all the kind of stuff, that canonical stuff that you will see in the bookstore that year is translated into Malayalam, and it's available, like the Salman Rushdie's, the whatever. And they may make a handful of copies, But it's interesting to see that thriving. And because we don't have that is where all these questions of unevenness and inequality and resentments begin, right? Of course, I can't write in any other language than in English. But if I chose to write a novel, how cool if it would be published back into Swahili or whatever, you know? So I think those are the issues at hand at the end of the day. It's the lack of strength in local publishing.
Thank you so much. Precisely mentioning Boubacar Boris Diop, I think he made this switch towards Wolof, writing into Wolof, after this project around the genocide. And he started with this novel, Doumi Golo, which was then published in French as Les Petits de la Guenon. And he has this stance, which is, in my opinion, extremely important because he forces the long-term perspectives that text creates the readership and not the other way around. In my opinion, this is very important because maybe the market is not already here for such language, but this will develop in time with investment and commitments like Ngugi's. Was all of his works published by East African educational publishers into Gikuyu in Nairobi. And like Boubacar Boris Diop, of course, I could mention a few projects, as for example, I think it was around 10 years ago, there was this series published, and this was an interesting project, shared between a French publisher and a publisher based in Quebec, Montreal, in Canada. The series names was C2, which was just a series of very important works translated from French to Wolof and to be distributed by this very imprint, especially in Senegal, where Wolof is strong. So you had Aimé Césaire, Mariam Abba, and the Nobel Prize Le Clézieux, who were translated into Wolof. And such perspectives, maybe they don't carry on a strong economical impact. Maybe the readership wasn't fully embracing because it takes time, but still this will remain and of course influence perspectives. I've heard that some publishers are now starting and trying to reset such an experience, so to say. And in my opinion, we need also thinkers like Boubacar Boris Diop to maybe have this way of standing for the future as well, for these languages that are maybe not strong enough in terms of publishing markets, but they could become. And at some point, a sparkle could always happen, and this is the case in every place in the world. I remember in Nigeria, the phenomenon in the 50s, so I don't remember, of course, but I've read about it in the 1950s, about these literature which were Onitsha market literature, which were widely broadcast towards the newspaper, and a full readership into Yoruba was raised from these writings. And as far as I'm concerned, especially writing by women writers. And this was a very strong phenomenon which impulsed somehow also publishing into Yoruba at that time. And this history is extremely important to remember because this is also an encouragement for the publishers that are committed at setting up new projects. I was mentioning ACOBooks, this is extremely strong audiobook platform that is so amazingly driven by Ama Datson in Accra. And they have about 20 African languages representing in their catalog, which is unique in the world. But I was mentioning Cassava Republic in Abuja, and they have started an imprint of African publishing. And then you have some festival. There is this festival of emerging African writers in Cameroon who is dedicated to African languages. This Somaliland Book Fair that is set up by, Jama Amos Jama, who is this strong figure for I don't want to say local language because those are just important languages. And I could also mention this Prix Saraounia, which was set up by Amalion Publishing in Senegal and with the support of a professor in Niger, Antoinette Tijani Alou, and dedicated to English French and Swahili, and awarding writing like this. And this is connecting me to the NOMA Award for Publishing in Africa, which was set up in 1980s, and awarding writing in Swahili, in Arabic, in French, in English, in Spanish, in Portuguese, be it published by an African publisher. And such prizes are extremely essential, and we need that to have this light towards these publishers and these languages that are also driving readers towards books that are maybe more connecting with them. So that's just my own take about that, maybe just on the enthusiastic aspect.
No, it's great.
If some of you wants to react, it's all right. We still have a few minutes left. There are so many things, and this topic is so huge, but we also have some questions in the chat, so maybe we could also pass through it and see if we could answer some of it, to not being too long, because I think time is always running fast when we are very passionate about a topic.
Raphael, this is Ashanta. I'm going through the chat right now. Can I read you a couple of the questions that have been posed? So one of them was about the difference between French in France versus French in versus African French. I can't find the question, of course, now, but I just recall seeing it. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
So you means me, the French one?
Yeah, the differences between French and African versions of French, and seeing translations from an African French to France's French, and vice versa.
Yes, that's a strong responsibility, but I could try. But then maybe our friends here could complete, because that's my own vision of French is that there is not, even in France, there is not a single French. There is not this very lingua franca, as we were saying. And French has always been evolving across the globe, and it's no more a matter of France, of course. And fortunately, it doesn't belong to one nation. Colonial time is now finished, fortunately, at least from some perspectives, let's say. And maybe now it's time to not only focus on this very way of writing, because this doesn't exist anymore. The classic French doesn't exist anymore, in my opinion. But maybe what is important now is in terms of translation. So I'm also maybe passing the relay to Tina, maybe, but or Bhakti or Hannes, that now then it's more a challenge of translation. How this language will be pictured into this other language. Could this language, I remember the case of, what's his name again? And now I'm forgetting.
Amadou Kourouma,
I was thinking about Amadou Kourouma, but also about a Pidgin English writer from Nigeria who was translated with some examples of this French from Ivory Coast, which was maybe not extremely representative, but this was maybe the closest the translator could get. And I'm not at all criticizing here the translator work, but this is the challenge of translation. I mean, the language does not belong. There is not a single language. There is not a French. This is just, it's a matter of transmission. But then it's a challenge of translator.
Right.
Yeah.
And it can be incredibly difficult, trying to kind of convey the cultural reflections in, let's say, non-metropolitan France French. You certainly can translate. You can try to translate into a similarly modified, let's say, English. But that comes down very much to the translator's own sort of command of alternative dialects isn't even the right word. This is such a tough question to answer. And there is some question as to whether or not a translation from sort of a pidgin type French or any other language, becomes really the work of the author or the work of the translator. Yeah, it's a tough question.
Terribly.
Obviously, because that answer really made no sense. So.
That actually, my question, and that was leading into it, was that how do you approach a translation when language is so nuanced, and you don't want to lose what makes the writing from the author special, but you're translating it for a different audience? How do you preserve those elements?
As a translator, and the best example I can think of would be this Haitian author that I recently translated, who also happens to work in a very kind of in a style that really straddles the line between poetry and prose. So this sort of added another layer of complexity in conveying the language. I mean, speaking as a translator, I think the key really is to allow the language to flow through you and allow yourself to become kind of a conduit for it, rather than forcing it into, strict English, for lack of a better word. It's important to retain that particular music that we get from, all these various Francophone language, versions of French.
Yeah, and I like to just say you also need to listen to your characters. You need to have a good understanding. Hopefully, if you're translating, you're really in tune with the characters that was created. And if you are struggling, because I can think of a very specific example where I struggled. In my Afrikaans version, it's easy. In South Africa, we use a lot of slang. So people would mix languages. And there was one example where there's one of my characters, a 16-year-old Indian girl, and she tries to impress this Afrikaans boy by using a few Afrikaans words, but she actually speaks English. So translating that was quite tricky because I could mix the languages in my Afrikaans one because I know all the readers would be able to read English, but translating into English, it's impossible because someone in America or wherever is not going to be able to understand the Afrikaans. So there I just had to listen to the character. I had to get into her head. How would she say this if it was just English? And sometimes you need to step back, and that's the beauty of being writing. Sometimes you have this almost out-of-body experience where you just let the character speak. And in translating, that's quite tricky because you don't want to miss those beautiful nuances. And that was so. And I've seen this in some translations that you can see a good translation. They just get the characters. The characters just come alive, and you have no idea. It doesn't matter what the original language was because they get the characters, and you feel it through them. So for me, but what Tina said about that music of the language, that comes through the character because they're the ones that sing. So that's what I have to say.
Yeah, and I'll just very quickly just add on to that to say that like writing, literary or writing fiction or writing a book can be is an isolated job. It's a job, you're alone and you have to do it alone. But translation has a fundamental sociality to it. And I think if you don't connect with the work and aren't going to do it to some degree collaboratively, if the writer is alive or maybe have a co-translator, I think one can lose some essential thing, especially the harder the work. I think the more social it needs to become with co-translators or with the author involved. and then like it can be bolder because, you know, when it comes to translation, it's not always translation, it's adaptation, and then questions of fidelity and loyalty to the original text. You know, if it's consensual, if it's done collaboratively, can go out of the window. You might come up with a whole new book, you know, and that's cool. And I think we have to be open to that too, in a way. Because sometimes, I mean, there are very hard to translate works, you know.
There are, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. But I mean, this is something, you know, we could talk about for hours.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's for sure that we could, but unfortunately, I think we don't have much time left. I don't know, Ashanta, what do you think?
Yeah, we should probably wrap up, but everyone should definitely look at the link that Alexander just put into the chat. How Africans are changing French, one joke, rap, and book at a time. Seems like some perfect after panel reading.
Indeed.
So yeah, I think we just need to wrap up here. So I'll just start my video again. For those of you who joined us late, my name is Ashanta and I'm with Catalyst Press. And I want to thank everyone for joining us for our very last Reading Africa Week panel. And, you know, many, many thanks to this incredible group of panelists who rescheduled on the fly. And it's just so wonderful. They tried to stop us. and yet we continued and had the most amazing conversation. And I really appreciate that. For all of our participants, we'll be putting the recording of this online, so stay tuned for that. And thank you all. And have a good night, afternoon, so forth. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
That was great.